The sun hung low over the small, dusty town of Pine Hollow, casting long shadows across the wooden storefronts and the hard-packed dirt roads where wagons rolled by in a slow, creaking rhythm. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, and where a person's worth was often measured by the way they fit into the neat, unspoken rules of what was considered proper. And on this particular evening, as the golden light faded into twilight, Rosalie Mayfield stood behind the counter of the general store, her hands busy sorting sacks of flour, her heart heavy with a loneliness she had long since grown used to. Rosalie was not like the other women in town, at least not in the way that seemed to matter the most. Where they were willowy and delicate, she was soft and rounded, her curves pronounced in a way that made the matrons whisper behind their hands and the young men look away, as if embarrassed by her very presence. She had heard the murmurs. "A shame she's built so sturdy. No man want a wife who takes up too much room." Words that stung no matter how many times she told herself they didn't matter. But Rosalie had learned to hide the hurt behind a warm smile and a willingness to help anyone who walked through the store's door. She knew the price of every bolt of fabric, the best remedy for a cough, and how to stretch a penny until it nearly snapped, and yet none of that seemed to matter when weighed against the shape of her waist. That evening, as she wiped down the counter for the third time, more to keep her hands busy than out of necessity, the bell above the door jingled, and in walked Elias Hart, the rancher from the far end of the valley. He was a man of few words, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent shadow of grief that clung to him like a second skin. Everyone knew his story. He had buried his young wife 2 winters past, and since then he had become as closed off as the old stone chapel on the hill, speaking only when necessary, and never lingering in town longer than he had to. Rosalie had seen him before, of course. Pine Hollow was too small for anyone to be a stranger, but he had never so much as glanced her way. Today was no different. His boots were dusty from the trail, his hat pulled low over his eyes as he moved toward the shelves with the quiet efficiency of a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. "Good evening, Mr. Hart," Rosalie said. Her voice warmed despite the way her heart gave a foolish little leap. "Can I help you find anything?" He didn't look up. "Nails and salt." She nodded and turned to fetch them, her cheeks burning for no reason at all. It wasn't as if she expected anything different. Men like him, men who still carried the ghost of a lost love, didn't see women like her. And even if they did, what then? She had been overlooked so many times that the weight of it had settled into her bones, a quiet ache she carried with her always. When she handed him his purchases, their fingers brushed for the briefest second, and Elias finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his gaze. Surprise, maybe, or just the faintest spark of curiosity. But then it was gone, shuttered away behind that familiar wall of silence. He tipped his hat, muttered his thanks, and was out the door before she could even wish him a safe ride home. Rosalie let out a slow breath, her hands curling into the fabric of her apron. It was foolish to hope, foolish to imagine that a man like him would ever see her as anything more than the shop girl who handed him his supplies. The town had made its judgment long ago, and she had learned to live with it. But as she locked up the store that night, the lantern light casting a warm glow over the empty street, she couldn't help but wonder, what if, just once, someone looked past curves and the whispers and saw her? Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees like a whispered secret. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonely and low, and high above, the stars blinked down, indifferent to quiet longing of a woman who dared to dream of being loved. The storm rolled in like an uninvited guest, dark and brooding, its thunder growling low over the hills as the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the dusty ground. Inside the general store, Rosalie had just finished tallying the day's earnings, her fingers pausing over the ledger as the sudden drumming of rain against the roof made her glance toward the window. The glass was already streaked with water, the world beyond it blurred into shifting shadows. She ought to close up soon. Storms like this had a way of turning the roads to mud, and no one would be out shopping now. Still, something made her hesitate, her hand hovering over the lock. Maybe it was the way the wind moaned through the eaves, or the way the lantern light flickered, casting uneasy shapes on the walls. Or maybe it was a strange, restless feeling in her chest, the one that had lingered since Elias Hart had walked out of the store hours earlier without so much as a backward glance. She was just about to pull the shutters closed when a sound cut through the storm, a horse's panicked whinny, followed by the heavy thud of hooves skidding in the mud. Rosalie pressed her face to the glass, squinting through the rain, and there, just beyond the hitching post, was a figure struggling with a thrashing animal. Even through the downpour, she recognized the broad shoulders and the way he moved. Elias. His horse, a tall bay with white blaze, was rearing, its eyes rolling wild with fear as the thunder cracked overhead. Elias yanked hard on the reins, his voice a sharp command lost in the wind. But the animal was beyond listening, its hooves striking dangerously close to him. Rosalie didn't stop to think. She grabbed her shawl and dashed out into the storm, the rain soaking through her clothes in seconds. The cold bit into her skin and the mud sucked at her boots, but she pushed forward, calling out, "Mr. Hart, here, let me help." Elias turned, his face a mask of surprise beneath the brim of his dripping hat. "Get back inside," he shouted, but Rosalie was already at the horse's side, her hands outstretched, her voice dropping into the low, soothing murmur she used with skittish animals. She didn't reach for the reins. That would only spook the creature further, but instead held her palm flat, letting the horse snuffle at her scent. "Easy now," she crooned, ignoring the rain streaming down her face. "You're all right. Just easy." Slowly. The horse's ears twitched forward, its breath coming in ragged huffs. Elias stared at her, his chest heaving, but Rosalie kept talking, nonsense words, soft and steady, until the bay finally lowered its head, its sides trembling but no longer frantic. Only then did she step closer, running her hands along its neck, her fingers finding the gash just above its foreleg, a deep, angry cut, likely from a stray branch or a fall in the dark. "He's hurt," she said, raising her voice over the rain. "You can't ride him like this." Elias's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "I'll walk him back." "In this storm? It's miles to your place." Rosalie shook her head. "Bring him around back. There's an old shed behind the store. It's dry, at least." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Pride was a stubborn thing, especially in men like him, who wore solitude like armor. But then the horse shuddered, and Elias's resolve cracked. He nodded again, and together they led the bay through the pelting rain, around to the small, weathered shed where Rosalie stored extra feed and tools. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and leather, but it was dry, and the lantern she lit cast a warm, flickering glow over the rough wooden walls. Elias tended to his horse with quick, efficient movements, his hands gentle despite their callous strength. Rosalie watched for a moment before slipping back into the storm to fetch water and rags from the store. When she returned, Elias had stripped off his drenched coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and old scars. He took the supplies from her without a word, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and set to work cleaning the wound. Rosalie should have left him to it. She should have gone back to the store, to her ledgers and her quiet, predictable life. But something kept her there, standing in the lantern light, her arms crossed against the chill. Maybe it was the way Elias's hands trembled just slightly as he worked, betraying a fear he'd never voice aloud. Or maybe it was the way the horse nuzzled at his shoulder, trusting him even in pain. "You're good with him," she said softly. Elias didn't look up. "He's all I've got." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken loneliness. Rosalie hesitated, then stepped forward. "Let me help." And to her surprise, he moved aside, letting her take the rag and press it to the wound. They worked in silence, the only sound the horse's steady breathing and the rain pounding on the roof. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles between people who understand, without needing to say it, that they're both a little broken. When the wound was clean and bandaged, Elias straightened, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "Thank you," he said, the words rough, as if he wasn't used to saying them. Rosalie smiled, though her heart ached at the weariness in his voice. "You're welcome." Outside, the storm raged on, but in that small, quiet space, something shifted, something fragile and uncertain, like the first green shoot pushing through winter-hardened ground. Neither of them spoke of it, but as Rosalie walked back to the store, the rain still falling. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had changed something. And as Elias led his horse out into the storm an hour later, his hat pulled low against the wind, he found himself glancing back at the store's glowing window, where a shadow moved behind the curtain, a woman who had seen his fear and hadn't turned away. The road home was long and dark, but for the first time in years, Elias' heart didn't feel quite so alone. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and golden, the kind of day that made the whole world seem scrubbed clean. Sunlight poured through the windows of the general store, turning the dust motes into tiny flecks of gold as Rosalie moved about her morning chores. She hummed softly under her breath, a habit she'd had since childhood, though today the tune was lighter than usual. Her fingers lingered on the counter where Elias Hart had stood the night before, his hands rough and capable as he counted out coins for nails and salt. She could still feel the ghost of that brief, accidental touch, his callous fingertips brushing against hers, and the memory sent an odd little flutter through her stomach. She shook her head, scolding herself inwardly. It was foolish to dwell on such things. Men like Elias didn't spare a second glance for women like her, no matter how many storms they weathered together. Besides, he was still grieving, his heart locked away behind walls thicker than the stone fences at Crisscross's ranch. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts, and Rosalie turned with her usual polite smile, only to freeze when she saw who stood in the doorway. Elias. He looked different in the daylight, his face no longer shadowed by the brim of his hat or the gloom of the storm. His dark hair was still damp at the ends, as if he'd washed up before coming, and his shirt was freshly pressed, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. In one hand, he held a basket covered with checkered cloth, in the other, a small wooden crate. Rosalie's mouth went dry. "Mr. Hart," she managed, her voice strangely breathless. "Good morning." He nodded, his boots scuffing against the floorboards as he stepped inside. "Morning." There was a pause, the kind that stretched just a beat too long, and then he held out the basket. "For you?" Rosalie blinked. "For me? Eggs," he said, as if that explained everything. "From my hens. Fresh this morning." She took the basket, her fingers brushing the rough weave of the handle, and peeled back the cloth. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw, were a dozen perfect brown eggs, their shells still warm from the sun. "Oh!" she breathed, and then, because she couldn't help herself, she laughed. "You brought me eggs?" Elias shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You helped me last night. With the horse. I didn't do much." "You did enough." His voice was gruff, but there was something underneath it. Something warm and hesitant, like a man testing the ice before stepping onto a frozen pond. Rosalie felt her cheeks grow warm. "Well, thank you. That's very kind." He nodded again, then held out the crate. "This too." She peeked inside and found a jar of honey, golden and thick, and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. "Did you bake this?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. A flicker of something, almost a smile, passed over his face. "No, Mrs. Wilkins down the road makes bread on Tuesdays. I traded her a chicken for it." Rosalie bit her lip to keep from grinning. "So you brought me eggs, honey, and bread. Figured you might be hungry." She was, suddenly, not for food, but for the quiet, unexpected kindness of a man who had every reason to keep to himself. "That's very thoughtful," she said softly. Elias cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward the door as if he was already planning his escape. But then he surprised her again. "Would you, that is, if you're not busy, maybe like to have supper with me tonight?" Rosalie's heart stuttered. "Supper? At my place. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and cornbread." She should say no. She knew she should. Nothing good ever came from hoping, from letting herself believe that this time might be different. But the look in his eyes, shy and hopeful and so terribly earnest, made the words stick in her throat. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. Elias exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath. "Good. I'll come by at 6. And just like that, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Rosalie standing there with a basket of eggs in her hands, and the strangest feeling that her life had just tilted on its axis. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Customers came and went, their chatter washing over her like distant waves as she restocked shelves and tallied orders, her mind 1,000 miles away. What had she just agreed to? Supper, with Elias Hart, at his ranch, alone. The thought sent a thrill of nervous excitement through her. She'd never been to this place before, though she'd heard the stories. A sturdy little house at the foot of the hills, surrounded by oak trees and wildflowers. A place built for a family, though it had stood empty for years. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, Rosalie had changed her dress 3 times, finally settling on a simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up, then taken it down, then pinned it up again, her hands trembling like a schoolgirl's. When Elias arrived, he was clean-shaven, his hair still damp from what she guessed was a hasty scrubbing in the horse trough. He took one look at her and froze, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "You look." He stopped, then tried again. "Pretty." Rosalie's face burned. "Thank you." The ride to his ranch was quiet. The only sounds the creak of the wagon and the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, and the air smelled of earth and wild sage. Elias's ranch was just as she'd imagined. A neat little house with a wide porch, a barn off to the side, and a garden that had clearly been tended with care. Chickens pecked in the dirt, and a fat orange cat lounged on the steps, eyeing them lazily as they approached. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, though sparsely furnished. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the table was set with mismatched plates and a single candle flickering in the center. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward. "It's not much." Rosalie smiled. "It's perfect." And as they sat down to eat, beans and cornbread, just as he'd promised, she realized with a start that for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like the girl who was too much of this and not enough of that. She just felt seen, and that, more than anything, was the rarest gift of all. The weeks that followed Elias Hart's simple supper invitation unfolded like the petals of a late-blooming rose, slow, tender, and achingly beautiful in their quiet transformation. Where once Rosalie's days had been measured in the rhythmic monotony of stocking shelves and counting coins, they now brimmed with unexpected sweetness, each moment ripe with the possibility of his presence. She found herself listening for the creak of the store's door with bated breath, her heart leaping at every shadow that crossed the threshold, only to settle when it wasn't him, and soar impossibly higher when it was. Elias came to town more often now, always with some small excuse, a need for flour, a broken harness that needed mending, a question about the price of seed. But Rosalie saw through the flimsy pretenses, recognized the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his rough hands fidgeted with his hat brim when she smiled at him. He was a man unaccustomed to wanting, and the unfamiliar terrain of affection left him stumbling, awkward as a colt on new legs. One such afternoon, as the heat of the day began to wane, Elias appeared in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-browned forearms, his boots dusty from the long ride into town. In his hands, he carried a bundle of wildflowers, a riot of purple lupin and golden poppies, their stems wrapped clumsily in a strip of old calico. "For you," he muttered, thrusting them toward her with all the grace of a man handing over a live rattlesnake. Rosalie took them, her fingers brushing against his, and brought the blossoms to her nose, inhaling their sun-warmed fragrance. "They're beautiful," she murmured and meant it. Never in her life had someone brought her flowers just because. Elias scuffed his boot against the floorboards. "They grow down by the creek. Thought you might like 'em." "I do." She hesitated, then added softly, "Would you like to walk down there with me sometime? To see them growing?" The question hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Elias's throat worked as he swallowed, his gaze darting to the window where the last of the afternoon light gilded the dusty street. "I'd like that," he said at last, the words so quiet she had to lean and catch them. And so it began their courtship, if one could call it that. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations. Instead, there were stolen hours by the creek, where Elias showed her the secret places where the wild strawberries grew, their tiny fruits bursting with sweetness. There were quiet suppers on his porch, where the fireflies danced in the gathering dusk, and the weight of their shared solitude felt lighter somehow, less lonely. There was the day he taught her to fish, standing behind her with his arms guiding hers, his breath warm against her ear as he showed her how to cast a line, and the way they'd both frozen when she turned her head, their faces suddenly inches apart, the air between them charged with something new and terrifying and wonderful. The town noticed, of course. Pine Hollow was too small for secrets, and tongues wagged over fence posts and laundry lines. Rosalie caught the whispers, the way the women at the church socialized her when she walked in on Elias's arm, the way the men at the feed store clapped him on the back with knowing grins. She expected the gossip to bother her, but to her surprise, it didn't. Let them talk. For the first time in her life, she felt chosen. It was on a Sunday afternoon, with the church bells still ringing in the distance, that Elias took her to the highest hill on his ranch. Below them, the valley stretched out like a patchwork quilt. Green fields, golden haystacks, the silver ribbon of the creek, winding through it all. The wind played with the loose strands of Rosalie's hair as she turned to him, taking in the way the sunlight caught in the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I used to come up here after Mary died," he said quietly, his voice rough with memory. Felt closer to her here. Rosalie's breath caught. He'd never spoken his late wife's name before. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Do you still feel close to her now?" Elias looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his expression so open it nearly broke her heart. "No," he said softly. "Now I just feel happy." And in that moment, with the wind singing through the grass and the whole world spread out before them, Rosalie understood that this slow, steady blooming of love was more precious than any whirlwind romance. It was roots digging deep. It was trust carefully built. It was two broken people finding that their jagged edges fit together in ways they never expected. That night, as Elias walked her home beneath a sky dusted with stars, he stopped at her doorstep, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her eyes burn. "Rosalie Mayfield," he whispered, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, "I think I'm falling in love with you." And when she kissed him, really kissed him for the first time, it tasted like hope, like second chances, like the first ripe strawberry of summer. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. But Rosalie didn't hear it. All she heard was the beating of her own heart, loud and sure and finally free. The little white church at the edge of Pine Hollow had never seen such a crowd. Every pew was packed with townsfolk dressed in their Sunday best, fanning themselves against the late summer heat that seeped through the open windows. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting pools of jewel-toned light across the wooden floor, and the air was thick with the scent of roses from the bouquets tied to the ends of each row. Outside, a chorus of cicadas hummed in the oak trees, their song rising and falling in time with the nervous rhythm of Rosalie Mayfield's heart as she stood in the small anteroom, her trembling fingers smoothing the ivory silk of her wedding gown for the 100th time. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly seamstress who had taken Rosalie under her wing these past months, clucked her tongue and adjusted the delicate lace veil pinned into Rosalie's carefully arranged curls. "Stop fidgeting, child," she chided gently, her knotted hand surprisingly steady as she tucked a stray wisp of hair into place. "You'll wrinkle the fabric before you even make it down the aisle." Rosalie forced herself to still, but her stomach continued its relentless fluttering. She could hear the muffled strains of the organ through the closed door, the rustle of the congregation shifting in their seats, the occasional cough or whisper that carried to the thin walls. In just a few minutes, she would walk through those doors and become Rosalie Hart. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, equal parts exhilaration and terror. "Do you think he's nervous?" she blurted suddenly, her voice higher than usual. Mrs. Henderson chuckled, her wrinkled face crinkling like well-worn parchment. "If that boy's half as nervous as you are, he's probably pacing a hole in the floorboards up by the altar." She patted Rosalie's cheek, her touch dry and papery. "But mark my words, the second he lays eyes on you, he'll forget there's another soul in this church." The organ music swelled then, the opening notes of processional vibrating through the floor. Rosalie's breath caught. This was it. The door opened and her father, a quiet, stoop-shouldered man who had surprised everyone by tearing up when Elias asked for her hand, offered his arm. His best Sunday suit smelled faintly of mothballs and the peppermint candies he always carried in his pocket. "Ready, Rosie girl?" he asked, his voice gruff with emotion. She wasn't, not even close. But she took his arm anyway and stepped forward. The sea of faces that turned toward her as she walked down the aisle was a blur. All she could see was Elias, standing tall and solemn at the end of the nave, his broad shoulders square beneath his new black suit, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When their eyes met, something flickered across his face, a softening, an awe, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The sight steadied her, anchored her, and by the time she reached his side, her hands no longer shook as she placed them in his. Reverend Michael began the ceremony, his deep voice rolling through the chapel, but Rosalie barely heard the words. She was too busy memorizing the way Elias's calloused thumbs traced circles on her knuckles, the way his Adam's apple bobbed when he swallowed hard, the way his eyes, those warm whiskey-brown eyes, never left hers, not even for a second. "Do you, Elias, take this woman?" "I do." The words were rough, immediate, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to say them. "And do you, Rosalie?" "I do." Her voice was steadier than she felt. When it came time for the rings, Elias's large hands trembled visibly as he slid the simple gold band onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm from his touch, and Rosalie marveled at how right it looked against her skin, like it had always belonged there. Her own hands were surprisingly steady as she placed his ring, wider, heavier, onto his finger, her heart swelling at the way his breath hitched at the contact. "You may now kiss your bride." For a heartbeat, Elias hesitated, his gaze searching hers as if asking permission. Then, with a tenderness that brought tears to more than a few eyes in the congregation, he cupped her face and brushed his lips against hers, a whisper of a kiss, sweet and reverent and over far too soon. The church erupted in applause, but Rosalie barely noticed. All that mattered was the way Elias's thumb caught the tears slipping down her cheek, the way he leaned his forehead against hers and whispered, so only she could hear, "Hello, Mrs. Hart." The reception was held in the churchyard beneath the sprawling oak trees, the tables laden with pies and roasted meats and the three-tiered spice cake Mrs. Henderson had insisted on baking herself. Children darted between the tables, their laughter mingling with the lively strains of the fiddle, while the adults sipped lemonade and shared stories of the couple. "Remember when Elias first came to town?" Old Mr. Grady cackled, slapping his knee. Surly as a bear with a sore head, wouldn't give a man the time of day. "And Rosalie," Mrs. Wilkins added, dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief, always so quiet in the store, like she was trying to take up less space. "Look at her now." And they did look. Rosalie, usually so reserved, was radiant as she spun across the makeshift dance floor in Elias's arms, her skirts swirling around her ankles, her face alight with joy. And Elias, well, no one had ever seen Elias Hart smile so much in all the years they'd known him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elias slipped his hand into Rosalie's and led her away from the crowd, toward the waiting wagon hitched with his best team of horses. Ribbons fluttered from the harnesses, and someone had tied an old boot and a tin can at the back. Pine Hollow's version of a send-off. Rosalie turned for one last look at the church, at the friends and neighbors who had gathered to celebrate them. Her throat tightened. For so long, she had felt invisible in this town. Now, as hands waved and voices called out blessings, she realized she wasn't just seen, she was loved. Elias helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Hart?" Home. Not just his home anymore. Theirs. Rosalie leaned into his side as the wagon rolled forward, the cheers of their loved ones fading behind them. Ahead lay the winding road to the ranch, to the little house that would now hold their shared life, their arguments and reconciliations, their quiet evenings and boisterous mornings, their hopes and dreams, and, God willing, the pitter-patter of little feet someday. As the first stars blinked to life overhead, Elias's arm tightened around her. No words were needed. The promise had already been made, before God and witnesses. But here, in the quiet of the gathering night, it settled into Rosalie's bones with certainty that would carry her through all the days to come. They were no longer just Elias and Rosalie. They were the Harts, And that, more than anything, was a blessing beyond measure. Winter came early that year, draping Elias Hart's ranch in a hush so profound that even the ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of the snow. Inside the snug farmhouse, Rosalie stood at the kitchen window, her palms pressed against the swell of her belly as she watched the first flakes of another storm spiral down from the iron-gray sky. The baby, their baby, kicked sharply beneath her ribs as if protesting the cold, and she smiled, tracing the shape of a tiny foot or elbow that pressed momentarily against her skin before disappearing again into the secret, watery world it inhabited. Behind her, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls where Elias had hung extra shelves just last week. For all the things babies need, he'd muttered, though neither of them had the faintest idea what those things might be. The whole house bore the marks of his nervous energy. The rocking chair he carved by lamplight after the chores were done, the cradle sanded smooth as silk, the curtains Rosalie had stitched from soft yellow calico, because it's cheerful, and babies ought to have cheerful things. A draft whispered through the room, and Rosalie turned to see Elias stomping snow from his boots in the doorway, his shoulders and hat dusted white from his hurried trip to the barn. His cheeks were ruddy with cold, his breath still coming in visible puffs as he shrugged out his coat. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, hanging his hat on its peg. "Doc said he'd come if we sent for him, but—" His eyes dropped to her stomach, then flicked away, as if he couldn't quite bear to voice the fear that had been growing in both of them these past weeks. What if the baby came tonight, with the roads impassable and the wind howling like a living thing? Rosalie crossed the room, waddling, really, though she never admitted, and took his icy hand in hers, rubbing warmth back into his fingers. "We'll be fine," she said, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. Women have been having babies without doctors since the dawn of time. Elias's throat worked as he swallowed, his calloused palm coming to rest gently on her belly. "You're not just any woman," he said hoarsely. The unspoken words hung between them. "And this isn't just any baby. This was their miracle, the life they created together after so much loneliness, after so many nights whispering hopes into the dark." The storm raged on outside, but inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of the stew simmering on the stove and the tang of pine from the Christmas wreath Rosalie had hung on the wall. They ate in comfortable silence, Elias's foot tapping in absent rhythm against the floorboards, a habit he developed these past months whenever his nerves got the better of him. After supper, he insisted on washing the dishes himself, his broad back turned to her as she settled into the rocking chair with her mending. It was there, with the firelight dancing across her needlework, that the first pain struck, a sharp, insistent pressure lowered her back that made her gasp and drop the tiny nightgown she'd been hemming. Elias was at her side in an instant, his hands hovering uncertainly. "Is it—" Rosalie nodded, her breath coming fast. "I think so." What followed was a blur of hurried activity. Elias stoking the fire, fetching the water and linens they prepared weeks ago, his movements precise despite the panic in his eyes. Between contractions, Rosalie laughed breathlessly at his frantic efficiency. This man who could calm a spooked stallion or mend a broken fence with ease, now utterly undone by the sight of his wife pacing the kitchen, her fists clenched against the pane. "Shouldn't you lie down?" he fretted for the third time, trailing after her like a lost pup. Rosalie shook her head, pausing to brace herself against the table as another wave crested. "Walking helps," she gritted out. As the hours crawled by, the pain intensified, wrapping around her like a vice until she could think of nothing else. Not the snow piling up outside, not the worried crease between Elias's brows, not even the life struggling to enter the world. There was only the fire and the sweat trickling down her temples and Elias's voice, steady as a lodestone in her ear, telling her over and over how strong she was, how much he loved her, how soon they'd hold their child. When the moment finally came, it was with a primal cry torn from Rosalie's throat and Elias's hands, those strong, capable hands, catching the tiny, squalling being that slipped into the world in a rush of blood and wonder. "A boy!" Elias choked out, his voice thick with tears as he placed a writhing infant on Rosalie's chest. The relief was instantaneous, a tide so overwhelming it left her trembling. Their son, their perfect red-faced, furious son, let out a wail that seemed to shake the very rafters, his tiny fists flailing as if indignant at the indignity of birth. Rosalie laughed through her tears, her fingers tracing the downy curve of his cheek, the shock of dark hair already curling at his temples. Elias sank to his knees beside the bed, his forehead pressed to Rosalie's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. "You did it," he whispered over and over, his fingers stroking their son's tiny back as if to reassure himself the baby was real. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind dying down to a whisper. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold, the fresh snow glittering like diamonds as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the clouds. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of the hearth and each other, the little family stayed cocooned in their blissful bubble. Elias's arms around them both, Rosalie's exhausted but radiant smile, their son's tiny fingers curled around his father's thumb, as if he'd known him all along. "Samuel," Rosalie murmured, brushing her lips against the baby's forehead. "After your grandfather." Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. And as the morning sun spilled across the bed, gilding the three of them in light, Rosalie knew with bone-deep certainty that this messy, miraculous, terrifying love was what she'd been waiting for all her life. The world outside could wait. For now, there was only this. The years folded over Pine Hollow like the pages of a well-loved book, each season etching its mark upon the land and the people who called it home. The Hart Ranch, once a quiet place of solitary sunrises and echoing silences, now thrived with a life so vibrant it seemed to pulse in the very timbers of the house. Laughter rang through the halls where once only the wind had whispered, and the porch steps bore the scuffs of small, eager feet that could never quite stay still. Samuel Hart grew like a sapling in fertile soil, straight-limbed and bright-eyed, with his father's strong jaw and his mother's quick smile. From a moment he could walk. He trailed after Elias like a shadow, his tiny boots kicking up dust as he struggled to match his father's long strides. Rosalie would watch from the kitchen window, her hands busy with dough or mending, her heart swelling at the sight of her husband bending down to show their son how to hold a hammer or soothe a skittish colt. Elias, who had once been so guarded with his affection, now wore his love openly, his rough hands gentle as they guided Samuel's small fingers, his voice patient even when the boy's endless questions tried what little patience he had. The townsfolk often remarked how much the child resembled his parents, not just in looks but in spirit. He had Rosalie's kindness, the way he'd stop to rescue a fallen bird or share his lunch with the Widow Jenkins' tabby cat. And he had Elias's quiet determination, the stubborn set to his shoulders when he vowed to ride his pony, without help or climb the tallest oak in the south pasture. But most of all, he carried within him the best of both their hearts, a boy who knew he was loved and loved fiercely in return. As Samuel grew, so too did the ranch. What had once been a modest spread now boasted a second barn, built by Elias's hands with Rosalie passing him nails and Samuel, under strict supervision, handing him tools. The field stretched farther, golden with wheat and alfalfa, and the herd of cattle had doubled, then tripled, their lowing a constant melody at dusk. Rosalie's garden became the envy of the county, bursting with plump tomatoes and fragrant herbs, the rows so neat they looked like stitches in a quilt. Neighbors would stop by under the flimsiest of pretenses, just to sample her blackberry jam or to bask in the easy warmth of the Hart family's table, where no one left hungry and every story was worth listening to. Evenings found them gathered on the porch, Samuel tucked between them as Rosalie read aloud from the Bible or a dog-eared book of fairy tales, Elias whittling toys or mending harnesses in the fading light. Fireflies would wink in the tall grass, and the air would hum with crickets, and Rosalie would catch Elias's eye over their son's head, sharing a silent conversation that needed no words. This, his gaze would say, this is everything. The years were not without their trials, of course. There were droughts that parched the earth and winters, so bitter the creek froze solid. There were moments of fear, when Samuel tumbled from the hayloft and broke his arm, when Rosalie fell ill with fever and Elias spent 3 sleepless nights pressing cool cloths to her brow. But through it all, their love remained the steady current that carried them, an unshakable foundation built on shared sorrows and shared joys, on whispered prayers and hands clasped tight in the dark. Time, as it always does, moved forward. Samuel grew tall and strong, his boyhood freckles fading, but his ready laughter never dimming. He took to the ranch work as if born to it, which Rosalie often teased Elias he was. though he had his mother's knack for numbers and his father's gift with animals. The girls in town began to cast shy glances his way, though he seemed oblivious, too busy dreaming of the future, a future that, he declared one supper, might include veterinary school back east. Rosalie had frozen at that, her fork hovering midair. Elias had set down his coffee cup with a thud, but after a long silence, it was Elias who spoke first, his voice gruff but proud. "If that's what you want, son, we'll make it happen." And they would, just as they'd made everything else happen. Through hard work and heart of love, through faith that never wavered even when the road ahead was unclear. Now, as Rosalie sat on the porch swing, her silver-streaked hair catching the late afternoon sun, she watched Elias and Samuel, no longer a boy but a young man, walking back on the far pasture, their easy banter floating on the breeze. Samuel said something that made Elias throw back his head and laugh, the sound rich and full, and Rosalie's breath caught. How far they'd come, her quiet rancher and their miracle child. How blessed they'd been. Elias caught sight of her and smiled, that slow, sweet smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. He said something to Samuel, who waved and veered off toward the barn, leaving Elias to climb the porch steps alone. Without a word, he settled beside her, his arms slipping around her shoulders as the swing creaked gently beneath their weight. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Hart," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Rosalie leaned into him, her hand finding his, their wedding bands glinting in the sunlight. "Just thinking how lucky I am," she said softly. Elias chuckled, his thumb tracing the lines of her fingers that had kneaded bread and bandaged scraped knees, that held him close through storms both literal and figurative. "Funny," he said, "I was thinking the same thing," and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the swing rocked gently, a silent testament to a love that had weathered decades and would weather decades more. For Elias and Rosalie Hart, this was a forever they'd dare to hope for, a forever built on second chances, on faith, on the quiet, unshakable certainty that no matter what the years might bring, they would face it together. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of Samuel whistling as he fed the horses, the promise of tomorrow alive in every note. The end. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe for more tales of love, faith, and second chances, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true love sees beyond the surface. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear what moved you most about Elias and Rosalie's journey. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Until next time, may your own story be filled with love as enduring as the heart's.